Gamers, what's going on? It's Preacher. Let's talk about the Mage Towers. I actually finished every single Mage Tower in the first Mage Tower after 7.3, which was a big disappointment to me, as I wanted to hit that pre-7.3 goal, but unfortunately there was just so damn many of them to do, which was a big issue. There was so damn many of them to finish up on the last Mage Towers, and of course, it really ground to a halt until Blizzard hotfixed how quickly the Mage Tower was going to come up. But I'm glad to say that the actual Nether Crucible didn't really come into play. It wasn't a big deal. I held off on the couple of remaining characters, which were the Hunter, the Warrior, and the Warlock, until I did their Mage Towers, because I didn't want to be skewed by them, but obviously it was out. There was nothing I could do about that. It was after 7.3. So I wanted to use this time to talk about the Mage Tower idea. And first of all, for those guys who are just interested in this, there it is in front of you. Those are what I consider the hardest to the easiest. For context on what that means, especially if you don't agree with some of that, continue listening on. When the Mage Tower was announced to come along with the Broken Shore, I assumed, as most people do who play at the higher end of the game, that it was going to be garbage content. Now, what I mean by that is if your character just naturally, let's say you're a raider or whatever, right? Or you're a high PvP or whatever it might be, you naturally carry a high level of gear just through the content that you play, right? That's a pretty normal thing. And when Blizzard introduces new content, traditionally, and it has been the case for a really long time, is it's already irrelevant to you when it comes out. So things like the Broken Shore or Argus brought 910 gear. Well, you know, if you're a raider or something, you're likely to be going into that content with 930 and above. The 910 stuff really doesn't make any difference to you unless it Titan Forges or does something crazy. So it's hard to get excited about that. And what goes along with that, and this happens with things like the Legendary quest line in WoD and all that kind of stuff, is you find that content very, very easy because it's designed for even like a fresh player to get started into that, right? It's looking for people who might have just dinged to be able to compete with that content. Therefore, when you do it on your character, things just fall over and die, and you kind of go, ooh, maybe you get a better experience on alts or something like that. But for the most part, that's traditionally what happens in WoW. Not so with the Mage Tower, though. We were all expecting this, and many, many players, if they're being honest, will attribute their Discord channels to being like, we're like playing at the highest end of this game, and we can't do this. This is really hard. We're struggling so much. But we did get them down on the day it came out on our main characters. Now, when it comes to which towers were easiest to hardest, there are definitely some that are naturally easier, just due to the class mechanics and all that kind of stuff. But often the big question is, before people approach the Mage Towers, after the initial reaction was, this is really hard, was what item level do I need? So, item level is probably like 3rd or 4th in the kind of like important information that you need. The big difference between the guys who did it, and this is where it gets really awkward, because the Mage Tower, unless you can really apply context to it, has really wild and skewed and varied opinions on it. Some people will tell you one was really easy, and then you'll get in there and it's like, this is not easy at all, actually. This is crazy. Not only that, some of the Mage Towers have been changed, but obviously people only ever do them once, right? You only do them once in that character, and then you have what you're after. You never go back. The Mage Tower changes. Some got easier, some got harder, and then you're trying to compare opinions on those. The big difference that I found, certainly when it came to doing this on multiple characters, which was suggested to me quite a while ago, but it seemed out of the realm of possibility. I had so many characters like 870-ish, they were miles away from being able to do it, and then I decided, right, I'm going for it, was that while you can easily kind of acquire a high item level, you can kind of push a character to get a high item level. There's a world of difference between a character with a high item level and a good set of a high item level gear. Optimized stats. What I ended up with on most of my characters, which for me, it kind of balanced out. It kind of balanced out the stuff that optimized characters had. I had a higher item level, but often I was carrying like the wrong stats for every character, and that kind of rebalanced it out. While one character might have what we want so much haste. We want haste constantly want haste. Whereas I just don't have any haste gear. What I have is like a combination of mastery and crit and versatility and all these kind of stupid things, which really negates what power we have. So I'm trying to work it that way. So in that respect, I don't think I particularly overgeared many, if at all. Like the Arms Warrior felt like I overgeared it, but it's naturally agreed upon that it's a particularly easy one anyway. Well, so on and so forth, that's kind of my thought process on it. The only one I'd say I did have to overgear to get through it was the Affliction Warlock, but we'll talk about that one later. On top of that, I said item level was third. So optimized stats is definitely number one. Like, having a character that is fully optimized and done well is doing so much more damage and raw tanking and healing than anything else. I would put that as number one. Number two is definitely legendaries. There is no doubt about it that the legendary influence on the Mage Tower was absurd in some cases. Not all, but in some cases, dramatically changed how those played out. And that is something Blizzard should have said, no legendaries in here. They should have balanced around there being no legendaries. I would have loved that to have happened, is that you're not using legendaries here, because certain legendaries absolutely completely flipped the table on whether or not it was hard or easy to get done. I talked about the prop parley one a few times. One that I found to be one of the most difficult, or the most difficult challenge that I did, was speaking to somebody who did it like world, I think he did it like world 7th, something like that. He was like, it's not that bad. It's not that bad. And I'm like, dude, this is insane. This one's crazy hard. Like, what are you talking about? And it turned out, like, obviously, he not only had a full set of optimized gear for what he was doing, but also had the perfect legendaries to go along with it, which trivialized several aspects of the encounter that I was really struggling with. So when I was asking him about these things, he would fire back saying, well, I didn't find that a big deal. And I was like, what are you talking about? This stuff's actually really hard. He's like, well, I didn't think it was hard. And then you check in, he's like, oh, you had all these kind of bonuses and stuff, right? That were constantly up and doing all kinds of cool and crazy things for you, which I did not have access to at all. And I'm sure many people will instantly default to the more famous one, which is the loofahs for the Guardian Druid. Having the loofahs for the Guardian Druid, I did it without the loofahs. I can't imagine what that challenge is like. And I could probably throw it over to Andy there, who also did the Guardian Druid without the loofahs, I believe.
Correct, mate.
Can't imagine what that is like with the loofahs. It must... I can't imagine.
It's so much easier.
Yeah, ridiculously easier. But the Guardian Druid for me, and this is why I'm bringing it back here, I rate the Guardian Druid as one of the most difficult challenges that I did. But I know that certain people with certain setups would go, it wasn't that bad. So... what I say is easiest to hardest might massively change for you. You would have definitely found some easier than what I did, and so on and so forth. So what's easiest to hardest? It kind of depends on the challenge. So I really wanted to dedicate this to talking about the challenges themselves, because I think that was that's the best way forward with this, and then maybe some fixes Blizzard can do in the future. First of all, what was the best challenge out of all of the towers? I've got to put it to the tanking one. I think the tanking one they nailed. There was only a couple of things in there that I didn't like. The tanking challenge, the thing I loved about it was definitely the movement and constant awareness of different things that are happening all over the map. Be it from eyeballs that are trying to target you, so your positioning has to be one way, to having to interrupt certain mobs, to also to be watching your feet because there's things happening directly in front of you, and looking where infernals are, and also dealing with the external. And the external, if you're not sure what I mean by the word external, Velen puts a healing orb down, which will also stun all the adds. Now, you have to really think about when you use that, because the tanking challenge is about control, which it should be. That's what we always teach tanks. What I do in every tanking overview of like the 5-part series of tanking is about control. And this first part is all about control. You have to control everything that's going on in a really good way. And you know that if you use a healing orb and it stuns the adds that are all spread out, that's really bad control, because you've lost a lot of damage that you're trying to organize onto yourself, which translates wonderfully into the game when you're trying to create these death balls and you're trying to make DPS as good as possible. You then see that happen in front of you because you feel instantly bad when you do things like that. You use a healing orb, you stun the adds, they're all spread out. This is really not ideal for what I want. I've wasted this opportunity. I absolutely adored how they designed that. More importantly than that, though, the idea of the second phase forcing you to not use major cooldowns in phase 1 because you're going to need them later. This is something a lot of tanks don't pick up for a really long time. They see their health dip, they panic, and they use a major cooldown. Now later on in the fight, that punishes you, and that is the way this tanking generally works in raids for most tanks. And to see that translated into the Mage Tower was fantastic for me. And what it taught you is a very valuable lesson, is just because your health dips, you can't panic. You have to remain calm. You have to stay calm. And not only that, you should be thinking, should I have taken all that damage in the first place? That's what tanking's all about. Yeah, I dipped really low there, and you'll probably see this in a lot of raids, particularly in normal and heroic, is, oh, I dipped really low, so I use shield wall. I don't have anything for the next one, and the cooldowns have already been assigned elsewhere. It's like, well, you're going to die to this. Yeah, but I dipped low, so I had to save myself. It's like, no, why did you dip low? You shouldn't have been dipping low there. That's not what it was about. And then fixing that is something that actually works out really well. So I adored the tank challenge for both of those aspects. And it was the challenge that gave me the most satisfaction getting done. The next challenge that I'm going to give big props to was the healing challenge. My big issue, let me get it out of the way now, the big issue with the healing challenge is that it was too long. It was far too long. Each try is about 20 to 25 minutes if you're doing well. That means you can't put in a lot of tries for most people. You're going to get a few in, and then depending on your free time, you're going to have to stop again, which I really didn't like. The tank challenge can be done in about 4 minutes if you do it well. 4 to 5 minutes, I would say. I'd have to check the logs, but around then. But the healing challenge is 5 times longer than that. Do you know what I mean? It's 5 times longer than that, which is a real bummer when you're learning it. Not only that, but the big challenges for me for the healing challenge are stage 1, which is exceptionally long. And then it doesn't happen again until stage 5. Everything in between is kind of a non-issue. And the final phase of the healing challenge is actually significantly easy as well. I never had any issue finishing that final phase. Every time I got there, I knew I'd won the fight on every healer that I did it with. That being said, though, it's understandable why it's longer, because they want mana to be a problem. They want you to be controlling your mana. If they'd made it shorter, certainly in stage 1, then you would have been able to just spam and never ran into issues. So it does make sense why they're longer, but the filler in between, I think, was a little unnecessary, but considering there's only, for me, 2 majorly difficult parts of that challenge. But, as I said, it did teach you mana control. It did teach you to use your lower skills that you might not be using. Very easy to see, certainly in LFR and stuff, is people using very expensive heals because the fights don't last long enough for it to be a problem. And then being like, well, I healed the fight and probably did really good healing because I spanned my most expensive, fastest heals. Where the healing challenge brought you back down. It was like, not only do you need to use your efficient heals that you might not ordinarily be using if you do a lot of dungeons in LFR, but not only that, you need to use your DPS, your CC, you need to use it properly, and you need to use your personal defensives. You need to be watching out for all these things, otherwise this challenge is going to be significantly more difficult, if not undoable for you. So that aspect of what it brought to healing, I thought was tremendous. I really enjoyed that. DPS, so yes, I thought the DPS challenges were actually the worst. I thought they got some major mistakes here with the DPS challenges. So what did I think was the best DPS challenge? This is going to be controversial, these are all reasonably close, but I actually thought the best raw DPS challenge was the Agatha challenge, for me. Now, the problem here is there's a sweet spot with the Agatha challenge where it's either really interesting and doable and you feel like you're pushing to get it done, or you undergear it and you can't get through it, and there's just nothing you can do, or you overgear it and you crush it into the ground. That is generally going to be the problem with DPS challenges that are based around doing raw damage, which most of these are. I mean, if she's immune, you're going for raw AoE and you're going crazy. There are some exceptions to this, like the Fury Warrior I felt was a little bit wonky for me, but for the most part, it was about making sure you were maximizing your damage, maximizing your cleave. That was something really nice, and then saving cooldowns, which is something DPSers don't really do until much later in the game for certain points. Like, okay, I have my DPS cooldown now, but I actually don't want to use it yet. That's what I want to see in the DPS challenges. Similarly, I actually quite enjoyed the Eye after a while. I had a bad start with the Eye. I thought the Eye was really irritating at first, but I started it with the Havoc Demon Hunter and the Frost DK. I think I did it in that order. And both of them had silly issues that I didn't enjoy. One, the Havoc challenge was a little too easy, and the Frost challenge, I had to zoom in really far because of the way tab targeting works in that fight. And once I got over those, it got done. The only issue I had with the Eye, which put it below Agatha, is that it's a survivability challenge for the most part. And if you can survive, you're fine. And then it actually takes quite a long time to get into the next phase. Once you've figured out how to survive, which is the puzzle of phase 1. Phase 1 can last a really long time. And at that point, you're like, I'm just going through the motions here because I can survive this. I know exactly what I'm doing. And it basically, I feel like the challenge is now baiting me to make a mistake at some point. Usually out of boredom. And I don't like that. It's like, am I going to get so frustrated trying to get this done that I might squeeze out an extra interrupt and risk it or something like that? It's kind of baiting you to take a risk. And if you do that, you're going to struggle. But anytime you've got patience in the first phase, which lasts a very long time, like I said, then you're going to get through it. I think the option to respec in phase 2 was a mistake. I would think the challenge would have been way more interesting if they made phase 1 shorter, but you had to choose the talents at the start that you also needed to use in phase 2, because several people, I didn't on most of the challenges, but certainly on Havoc I did. I don't think I did on anything else, actually. I might have done. I think I'm maybe on arms. But you do have the opportunity to sit down, respec, swap gear, and do all this kind of stuff between phase 1 and 2. I think that was a mistake. I think it would have been more interesting to say, what am I giving up here? Some single target for some more cleave in phase 2. What about slows? Can I afford to not take the slow, or do I need the slow, which is not useful for me in phase 1? I think having that thought process going into the eye would have been more interesting. But either way, it was a good challenge, and I enjoyed that. Now we get to the really bad ones. The Twins encounter. The Twins encounter isn't really, really bad unless you're an Affliction Warlock. The Twins encounter, unfortunately, is just kind of tedious, and it has a little bit of RNG in it, which can really just make you feel like you're screwed unnecessarily. And I don't like any challenge that just throws this in, and you're like, I can't see any way I'm supposed to survive this. And that can happen on a few occasions, unless you completely outgear it. And this is another one of the DPS challenges where if you outgear it, you can actually blast through and bypass a lot of the stuff that might lead to RNG. So I've no doubt there's people listening to this right now who blasted through it who are like, well, I didn't see any RNG. Probably not, because you didn't have to do the mechanics for a really long time. But the actual Twins encounter was the first challenge I did. It was my Frost Mage challenge on the day the Mage Tower came out. And boy, did we see some of the horrors that fight can throw at you if you play it out for a long time, particularly with runes spawning exactly where the ads are. And these ads really damage you. And therefore, you're like, I have no choice but to go and stand here. I have no opportunities to do anything else. Although you can manage where the hand spawns, because it always spawns behind Raced. I hope I'm getting his name right. The guy who follows you is Raced, I think, or Karen.
It is, mate.
It is, there you go. Unless it spawns there, you can control that, but sometimes the rune just spawns in the worst place ever, and there's ads all over there, and you've been slowing them, you've been controlling them as you're supposed to do, and then suddenly you gotta go and stand there. Now you got, I've got an ice block, cool, I can go and do that, but on other classes, that's not the case, and definitely on certain characters, when I went to stand in the rune, it was like, there's nothing I can do here. This is really irritating. Stop, start again. And basically the whole challenge boils down to, can you control Race long enough to kill him? And if you could do that, basically the challenge is done once you hit a certain amount of gear. I never really got an exciting feel from it, besides the first time on the Frost Mage, when I actually overcame it and got it done. Now we're into the really bad ones. So I've put, second to last here, I've put the High Mountain Challenge. I never, ever, ever enjoyed this challenge on any way, shape, or form. And I'm hoping I can find the clip. Not only was this challenge super dull, it was an interrupt challenge. And the idea that you were to control the worm to travel through the stalactites in order for it to shatter the shell, I thought was a decent idea. Because not only did you have to interrupt and do target switching, but you also had to be aware of this ad moving around and doing that. The problem for me really boiled down to, one, this challenge was never difficult on any character. It was completely mundane. But also that the worm under the floor had a really weird travel pattern that he could take sometimes. And he was separate from the worm that actually came out the ground. Now, most of the time, in at least 9 out of 10, or even 45 out of 50 tries, it's never a big deal. But there's a couple of clips, and I hope I can find them out of the hours of footage I got to sift through, where the worm on the floor was actually traveling around while the worm was out. Which makes it just look stupid. It makes it look like a stupid encounter. This doesn't make any sense. And there's definitely many times when I'm sure certain players will back me up on this, where suddenly that worm under the floor, it says charge, you move out of the way, you've got it going where you want to, and it'll divert into you. And one of the only ways you can die in that encounter is being hit by the worm. And if you get hit by the worm, you're kind of falling behind, and then you're like, ugh. Not only that, the guy had too much HP. It was just designed to wear you down, which meant that any form of healing Lego completely nullified it. So if you had a Pride As or a Roots or something like that that gave you any form of passive HP gain or defense, there's no difficulty there. There's no challenge. And therefore, it was just a really dull encounter. The most disappointing challenge of all for me was Sigrun. I didn't enjoy any of the Sigrun challenges, and I never struggled with any of the Sigrun challenges. This encounter for me really highlighted the big issue that I want to say, and I'm going to throw it out there, it's the Diablo 3 team coming into WoW and trying to put Diablo 3 stuff into WoW. And I think the thing that we've seen over the course of Legion's PvE, which has been the idea of overlapping mechanics, which has become more and more prevalent. We saw it a little bit in WoD, like the Twin Ogron had a bit of this, but now in Legion it's very widespread. And I think the Sigrun Challenge really demonstrates why this is a poor mechanic, certainly for World of Warcraft. Now, what I mean by this is the actual challenge of the Sigrun encounter is that the encounter has a whole bunch of mechanics. There's like 6 or 7 different things that can go on in that fight. But at some point in the fight, they're going to have all those abilities overlap. So it might be the damage shield that you have to break on the Runecaster, plus the Valkyrie spinning through, plus an Interrupt or a Fear, plus some form of CC on another mob. And at some point, and it usually happens around 50%-ish, I want to say somewhere between 55 and 45%, it's around that area, all of those things are going to overlap together. Now, that's difficult, and often that's when people are going to really struggle, is getting through that, and that's when people are going to pop Bloodlust and whatnot. However, the issue that I have with this, and I think it highlights it so clearly, is that if you're going to design a fight around the idea that all these things are going to overlap at some point, none of those mechanics individually can really be a big deal. Because otherwise they're unmanageable when they overlap. You can't make the DPS shield on Runecaster super tight to destroy, because you're going to overlap it with Valkyrie, and that means that the melee and stuff are going to have to run away from the Runecaster to bypass the Valkyrie and then come back. That's a lot of lost DPS time. So the DPS shield can't be that strong. It just can't physically be that way, otherwise no one would get it until the Valkyrie somehow managed to line up perfectly with where the Runecaster is. And this is what I'm saying. Once you have all these individual little tiny mechanics, they have to be reasonably trivial or on their own or in small combinations in order to allow for this big, here comes the overlap, now you've got to deal with it. And what that meant was, certainly if you could CC Sigrun, was that the fight was extremely long, they had huge amounts of HP, and it was just dull from start to finish. And you were kind of, once you'd had a few tries at it, you were kind of just waiting for this one point when these things overlapped, and that was it. It was done. And once you got past there, not only that, they actually switched off most of the mechanics. Below 40%, I want to say it's about below 40%, about 35%. They actually switch off most of the mechanics in the fight, except the damage shield and the Valkyrie. And then you're just tediously wearing them down until it's finished. I think that was a big highlight there for Sigrun. My best challenges, certainly Prot Paladin, Guardian Druid. Absolutely adored those challenges. Got huge, immense satisfaction from that. I'd also put Outlaw down there. Outlaw was a challenge that I really had to push against. So enjoyed that. And pretty much every healing challenge. Every healing challenge I got great joy out of. The worst encounter that I did, though, was the Affliction Warlock. I have no idea why they designed it that way, so that either you had ludicrous overgearing to the point where you could blow up the character, which I'm sure some people did in phase 1, or you had to have one of 2 certain Legos. I did it with the teleport legs, the portal legs, so I could use my gateway twice. Most people want the corruption ring to slow that target, but running, if you don't have those, which is how I learnt it, running in circles with that is just stupidity. Terrible, terrible design. Should never do it again. I want to see more of this content. I want to see more of this content in the future, because it was great fun. I had some really good highs and really good lows and some really good struggles to overcome, and that's what I love about this game. I want to see more of it. I think you definitely need to have a set gear set in mind. I think Blizzard should give you a predetermined armor set. They don't need to worry about trinkets. They could simply make them stat sticks, something like that. But make sure that they have something set in stone so the challenge is fair for everybody. Because I would really enjoy this to be a skilled thing. And if they and one thing they did say is that, yes, this is really hard, but we do eventually want people to overgear it because it's a cosmetic reward, all that kind of stuff. They can change that later. They can make that flexy later. But I would absolutely have adored if they had it set in stone when it came out, at least for the first period. So, you know, up until 7.3, now you can use your own gear in there and you can go in and crush it. That's fine. But until then, you're going to use this set amount of gear, so that people don't seem to want to farm and waste nether shards to only find out or feel that they can't do it, or it's not worth investing time in when they might be able to do it. I don't think that's a good idea at all. I would certainly try and think more reasonably when it comes to the DPS challenges, because obviously they've got to cover way more DPS specs than they do tanking or healing, and give it variety, is not to make the challenges about one key thing. So it's just, this is the interrupt challenge, right? And this is the survivability challenge. This is the raw DPS challenge. This one is the overlapping abilities encounters. Like, mix it up. Multi-phase DPS fights would have been way more interesting. I think that would have been the way to go. Certainly if it involved a little bit more interesting CC. We did see some CC, certainly with the Sigrid challenge, but it wasn't interesting CC. It was just, let's lock somebody out of the fight. That's not that interesting. And even having to add modifiers to your spells to make that better. Ladies and gentlemen, the Mage Towers. More, please. Bye-bye.